Hey everyone, it's Mike here from Music for Busy People. Dev is ill. She has a really bad cold, so I've given her some time off. So in the meantime, in between reaction videos to classic rock, we're going to be counting down the top 25 albums of all time. First of all, this is not my own personal preference list. These aren't like my 25 favorite albums. This list is based on some research that I did, a little bit of my own personal opinion, but mostly just sort of what I feel is the general consensus and what I know about these albums. Did they have a big impact? Were they groundbreaking? Were they important? A lot of these albums didn't do too well when they first came out or weren't well received, but later when people look back at them, they realized how good they were. So albums that sort of stand the test of time. Most of the albums on this list are rock albums. To set expectations, there are no albums on this list from the last 30 years. Okay? But I just didn't feel like anything in the last 30 years cut it compared to some of these other classic albums. Also, most of the list is from the 60s and 70s. An artist or band could appear more than once. Surprise, surprise, the Beatles are on here several times. Okay, you just can't deny that they have had that much of an impact. Except for the Beatles, I tried to force it so that no artist or band would be on here more than twice. Okay, here we go. Number 25. It's 1982's Thriller by Michael Jackson, of course. I think it deserves to be on the list just because of how huge it was. It certainly had an impact, and it's a good album. I mean, you can't deny that it's a great pop album. The whole MTV generation and making those incredible videos that they made for that album, and Eddie Van Halen is a guest on it, and Paul McCartney is a guest on it, and Vincent Price is a guest on it. Number 24 is Electric Ladyland by the Jimi Hendrix Experience from 1968. We had to have something from Jimi Hendrix on here. Of course, Jimi Hendrix was a genius, and he had a huge influence. This was the band's most successful album. It was a double album, and it really showcases Hendrix's diversity. I believe this was his last album. It was the only album I think that he produced. I think if he lived longer, he would have made more albums and evolved even more and probably been higher on this list. Number 23 is the most recent album on this list. It's from 1992. It's Automatic for the People by REM. REM was one of those bands that just kept getting better every time they put out another album. Their previous album was so popular, Out of Time, that they released a greatest hits album. And then they come out with this album after their greatest hits. So it's kind of interesting, even though this could be considered by many their greatest album. They had great longevity, and they had an impact for a while on alternative rock and other kinds of rock as well. Okay, with number 22, we're back to the 60s. This is The Doors, their debut album. I wanted The Doors on this list. I didn't particularly have an album that stood out in my mind, but when I did my research, most people consider this their best album, but it's their debut album, which is also significant. For number 21, we go to 1979, London Calling by The Clash. The Clash are on this list because they helped cement a new kind of music that would take on into the 80s. This was a double album. I mean, it was moderately successful, but they had bigger success a few years later with their subsequent records, like Should I Stay or Should I Go? This was the album where they weren't just a punk band anymore. They helped usher that kind of music into the 80s. Number 20 is by the Rolling Stones, 1971's Sticky Fingers. I love this album. I had older siblings, so I got exposed to this kind of music at a very young age. Just look at the songs that are on this album. You have Brown Sugar, Wild Horses, Can't You Hear Me Knocking. We will probably be doing a reaction to this album on our channel at some point. This was the Stones' first studio album where Mick Taylor played on the whole album. It had a classic cover. Andy Warhol, I believe, conceived of this cover. It's jeans with a real zipper on it. You kind of assumed it was Mick Jagger, but it probably wasn't. Wearing jeans, and it had a real zipper, and you open the zipper and you can see the underwear inside. I think on some pressings, the underwear was actually cloth. And they eventually got rid of the zipper because it was too expensive to make, and I think it was also causing problems with stacking albums. It could damage an album. This was also their first album on their own record label. So it's the first appearance of the tongue logo. Number 19 is Rumors by Fleetwood Mac. This one came out in 1977. This should not be a surprise to most of you. Everybody loves this album. If you're not familiar with it, if you hear the songs, you would know almost every song on this album. I think every song on this album just about was a hit. It was critically acclaimed from the beginning. It's definitely Fleetwood Mac's greatest album. Number 18 is David Bowie. It's 1972. Shouldn't be a surprise which album it is. The Rise and Fall of Ziggy Stardust and the Spiders from Mars. This album made him a big star. But I don't think when it first came out, it was that big a hit in the US. Now, it didn't take long for it to become a classic here as well. It's one of those albums where you know almost every song on the album. You've heard it. And David Bowie played that character and did a tour as that character. This album is glam rock at its finest. And we'll probably be doing a reaction video to this album. And I haven't heard it in a long time, so it meets my criteria. Number 17 is an album that we've already done a reaction video for on our Patreon. It's Who's Next by The Who, 1971. 1971 was a good year for albums. And this is one of the greatest albums. I think The Who sounded thinner before this album, and this is a much thicker, heavier sound, and that stayed with them. You probably have heard of all these songs. Like I said, if you don't know the title, then just check out the song. Side 1, Baba O'Reilly, Bargain, Love Ain't For Keeping, My Wife, and The Song Is Over. Side 2, Getting in Tune, Going Mobile, Behind Blue Eyes, Won't Get Fooled Again. Number 16 is an album that I never even heard before I did research for this. It's by Van Morrison. This is his second album, I believe, Astral Weeks. It's from 1968. I don't think this album was very well known. It didn't do well. But this is one of those albums that later, when people looked at it again, all of a sudden people were saying, a lot of artists were saying how the songs on this album and the songwriting on this album was a huge influence on them, even though it wasn't his most popular album or his most well-known album. Number 15, we have the first appearance of the Beatles on this list. It's from 1965's Rubber Soul. This was the first time, I think, that the Beatles decided to make an album, as opposed to writing a bunch of hit singles and then taking them and maybe filling in a few more songs and making an album out of that. So instead of having singles driving an album, they had an album, and that might produce singles, but the album was the focus. It still produced a bunch of great individual songs, but the album as a whole is a more cohesive listen. Number 14, one of the rare 80s albums on this list, 1987's Joshua Tree by U2. This was U2's most successful album, I believe. They did have a big impact on music back then. It's unique. It's got great songwriting, great playing. There's political messages. It certainly had a great impact. This next artist could have been on this list many times. Bob Dylan had to be on this list. And number 13 is 1975's Blood on the Tracks. And why did I choose this one? 1975. Okay, this is like his 15th album or something. He was huge in the 60s, but here he is in the 70s, and he's still putting out one of his best albums ever. Usually by the time they get around to 15, they lost a little something. But he did not. He could still write impactful songs. I do not think he had a great voice. I could never get over that. But I definitely like some of his songs, but he's just not my personal preference. But that doesn't mean he doesn't belong on this list. Number 12 is another album I'm not very familiar with, especially before I did research for this. It's from 1967. It's the Velvet Underground's first album. It's called The Velvet Underground and Nico. Nico was a German artist who joined the band, sang some of the songs, but most of the songs are sung by Lou Reed. He's the main vocalist and lyricist. Many people consider this the first alternative rock album ever. It had to be on here. It certainly was influential. It launched a genre, but initially it sold poorly. It was one of those later people said, oh, that had an influence on me, and that had an influence on me, and that people rediscovered it. The album cover is by Andy Warhol. Here is Andy Warhol again. And he's listed as the producer, but he didn't really produce the album from a music perspective. He basically paid for the recording sessions, I think. And he gave total freedom to the band. So that's how he contributed. Number 11. Here is a group I would like to have on here many times, Led Zeppelin. And of course you have to have Led Zeppelin 4, or the Untitled Album, or Zoso, or whatever you want to call this album, from 1971. This is the album with Stairway to Heaven. This is the album with Black Dog, Rock and Roll, When the Levee Breaks. Every song on this album is classic. This was the kind of album that everybody would have owned in the 70s. Even if you weren't a huge heavy metal fan, you would probably own this album if you liked rock music at all. It's not even my favorite album of theirs, but it's one of my favorites, of course. Everybody knows almost every song on this album. I'm not going to say that much about this album either, because we've already done an entire series of reaction videos to every song on this album. Check those out. There'll be links in the description. Number 10, we have the Rolling Stones again with Let It Bleed, 1969. This was the album where Brian Jones was fired. So he appears on the album a little bit, but not much. Most of the guitar work is done by Keith Richards on this album, all the guitar parts. There's some overdubs done by Mick Taylor, who eventually became a full member of the band, but it's mostly Keith Richards on this album, which is pretty incredible. This was the Stones at their peak. So Honky Tonk Women could have been on this album. They didn't. They just left it as a single, but that could have been on here as well. Can you imagine? It's already a super strong album. You add that to it, oh my goodness. And You Can't Always Get What You Want is on this album, so that's classic. That was the B-side to the Honky Tonk Women single, which is interesting. Number 9, nobody will argue with this one being on this list. You might think it should be higher maybe, but that's The Dark Side of the Moon by Pink Floyd, 1973. I have very strong memories as a young child hearing this album. Every song on this album was played a lot on radio stations as well. But this is one of those albums where you want to listen to the whole album. The songs flow into each other. And they're just meticulously produced and performed. Everybody knows this album. Everybody talks about this album. I don't need to go on too much about it. We'll probably be doing a reaction video to this album very soon. Because you have to. I can't wait to do it. And Dev has never heard it all the way through, so there you go. This was the album that catapulted Pink Floyd into international success. Number 8, 1965, Highway 61 Revisited by Bob Dylan. As I said before, because of his influence, Dylan deserves to be on this list multiple times. This was his first album that wasn't mainly acoustic. He actually has rock musicians playing on this album. So this was his start of his folk rock period, which pretty much didn't go away. So that makes it significant. Of course, it has like a Rolling Stone on it. I don't have that much more to say about it because I'm not super familiar with it because, like I said before, I'm not the biggest Bob Dylan fan. But I respect his greatness and his influence and his songwriting. Just not his singing that much. Sorry, Bob Dylan fans. So number 7 is What's Going On by Marvin Gaye, 1971. There's that 1971 again. I think in the future I may do some videos where I just focus on one year and maybe do the top 10 albums of that year or whatever. So Marvin Gaye is noted for his hits like I Heard It Through the Grapevine and the title track of this album. This album was a concept album and the songs flow into each other. The lyrics are told from the perspective of a Vietnam vet who comes home and witnesses what's going on in the country. Well, it's been a while since we've had the Beatles, so let's talk about number 6. Now, a lot of you are going to think this should be higher on the list. But here's where I put Sgt. Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band, 1967. Yes, this album was groundbreaking. Yes, this album had a lot of firsts on it. But I didn't put it higher. Well, we'll talk about why when we get to the other albums. But this is when the Beatles were done touring. they decided they were just going to focus on making albums in the studio. Of course, this is a concept album. I think it was the first album that had lyrics on the back cover. Of course, the art design is very interesting. It's got a great cover and a lot of cool, colorful photos of them and their regalia. And this album really cemented the era of the album. I'm pretty sure once this album came out, most bands were like, we're just going to focus on making albums. Before we get into the top 5, I'm going to rattle off a few albums here that get an honorable mention. Some of these are on here just because they were almost good enough. Some of these are on here because they probably were good enough, but maybe I didn't want to put them on there because that band was on here already. The first one I'm going to mention is Exile on Main Street by the Rolling Stones. A lot of people consider that their greatest album. Blonde on Blonde by Bob Dylan. That's another album that could have been on this list, but I just felt like there was enough Bob Dylan on this list. This album is interesting. Forever Changes by Love. This is an album I never heard of. When I was doing research for it, this is on so many people's list of greatest albums of all time. And I'm like, what? I never heard of this thing. It came out in 1967. It's so obscure that I didn't feel like it belonged on the list, even though it supposedly had this huge impact on all these artists. The Queen is Dead by the Smiths. I'm not a big fan of the Smiths or that kind of pop music, but in honor of our UK community, it's a good representation of that 80s British pop type of music. Radiohead didn't quite make the list, but if I was going to put them on the list, I guess I would put OK Computer. That was a groundbreaking album for them. They really changed their style for that album. I'm not a huge Bruce Springsteen fan, even though I'm originally from New Jersey. And of course, Born to Run was his huge album that made him a huge superstar. I don't have any jazz albums on my list, so I wanted to give it at least an honorable mention to a jazz album. And I guess if I had to pick one, the biggest one that I can think of is Kind of Blue by Miles Davis. Speaking of blue, Joni Mitchell is another very influential artist. Blue by Joni Mitchell. An album that I remember as a small child, Tapestry by Carole King. There are so many classic songs on this album. I think almost every song on this album was a hit back then. And there's no real Southern rock on this list, so I want to give an honorable mention to one. I guess I would pick Hotel California by the Eagles. That's a great album. On to number 5, the top 5. For number 5, I chose the White Album by the Beatles, of course. 1968. This album is significant, and I think it's amazing because, first of all, it's their only double album. This was the Beatles becoming more individual. It's almost like if they were solo artists and they each made like a half a record and you put it all together, like that's what you would get. Definitely more individuality on this album. George Martin once said that he thought it should have been a single album, that it wasn't, some of the songs weren't their strongest work, but it would be an incredible single album as opposed to a not quite as good double album. Most of us don't agree with that, but I actually I'll put a link in the description. I actually did a short video where I said what I thought if I was going to make the White Album into a single album, what I would do. So check that out if you're interested. Number 4 is also by the Beatles, 1969's Abbey Road. We all know this album as well. It's a classic. It's got a classic cover. A lot of people think this is the Beatles' finest album. Although it wasn't the last album released by the Beatles, it was the last album they recorded. They did Let It Be, and they had a lot of problems with that. This is sort of them saying, look, let's just get back to what we're good at. And they made an amazing album. This is probably George Harrison's strongest contribution to albums as a whole. His 2 songs, Something and Here Comes the Sun, are some of his best. And of course you have that amazing side 2 montage of all the different short songs blending together as one big cohesive unit. And the concept on side 2 ends beautifully with the song The End, because they suspected that that might have been the last thing they were going to do together. It's really a credit to what a great band they were, that they could produce something that good at the end of their existence. Okay, we can take a break from the Beatles now. People may think this one's too high. I don't know. I wanted to have something high on the list that was more recent if it deserved it, and this certainly deserves it. So number 3 is 1991. And of course I'm talking about Nevermind by Nirvana. So this album was a huge smash hit, and it was a total surprise. But this album was so big, it brought grunge into the mainstream. And as a result, Nirvana was the biggest band in the world. It basically cemented another genre. It has a famous cover. They were only around a few years. Can you imagine if they were around longer, what kind of an impact they could have had? They were just getting started. Number 2 is Pet Sounds by the Beach Boys, 1966. Who would have thought the Beach Boys, Surfin' USA and all those great classic songs they used to write, would end up being the second greatest album of all time? But it's basically because of the innovation. It's not even my favorite Beach Boys songs. I love the Beach Boys for their older stuff. This was one of the earlier albums to use the studio as an instrument. Every song is its own little work of art. There's a lot of instruments, a lot of not traditionally rock instruments on this album, a lot of classical instruments. The songs all go together in that they were all produced meticulously and uniquely. Brian Wilson utilized a lot of the techniques of the Phil Spector Wall of Sound. He certainly has complex arrangements, both for the instruments and for the vocals. While the rest of the band was out touring, he was working on this album, which heavily relies on studio technology to get the effects that he wanted. Brian Wilson claimed that Rubber Soul was the inspiration, or at least one of the big inspirations for him doing this album. Unfortunately, for him and the Beach Boys, once Sgt. Pepper came out, everybody forgot about this album. So it kind of blew it away. And I don't think it got the recognition it deserved back then because of that, because Sgt. Pepper overshadowed it. Paul McCartney has said that this album was an inspiration for Sgt. Pepper. By process of elimination, you could probably figure out what the last album is. Yes, it's a Beatles album. It needed to be a Beatles album. What's the only one left that could possibly be it? Revolver, 1966. Everybody used to think Sgt. Pepper's their greatest album. Sgt. Pepper's their greatest album. Most people have sort of come to the consensus that no, this is their greatest album now that you think about it. And I think it's because this is really when they started with a lot of their innovations that they built upon for Sgt. Pepper and other albums. The band members have started to become more involved in the producing of the songs. It's very experimental, especially Tomorrow Never Knows. You can just listen to that song and you're going to hear something that people never heard anything like that before. Tape loops, the drum sound. They did close miking on the drums, which gave it a huge sound. Vocal effects, backwards recording. This is when they started with the varying speed stuff where they would play things faster or slower and then speed it up or slow it down for the record. And it's got a great cover, which doesn't hurt when making something a classic album. And that's it. Please, leave comments. Let's have a nice discussion about what you guys think. What's on your guys' list? What did I leave off? What did I put too high? What did I put too low? Let's all be nice to each other, though. And let me quickly say thank you to our patrons. Dev wants to thank you as well. Like I said, she couldn't be here for this video because she wasn't feeling well. If you're new to our channel, we mostly do reaction videos to entire albums. But we're going to be doing other videos as well, stuff like I'm doing right now. I want to thank all of you who have subscribed so far, and we're a growing channel, so if you haven't subscribed yet, I really would appreciate it. It'll really help us out a lot. And of course, all the other things you guys do to help out, it's appreciated as well. Commenting, liking the videos, sharing the videos. Whatever you can do to help is greatly appreciated. And if you haven't checked out any of our reaction videos, what are you waiting for? So I hope to see you soon on another video. Ta-ta for now. We love all of you. Deb says hi.